Hi, everybody. Our study, as you know, on the Lord's Day for quite a little while now, going toward 2 quarters, has been on the book of Luke. And this morning, we have arrived at Luke chapter 20. So if you'll turn your Bibles there, we will begin to look at what Luke has to say about this time during which Christ is walking in the city of Jerusalem during the day, spending the night at Bethany. So look at verses 1 and 2, if you would. Now it happened on one of those days, as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel, that the chief priests and the scribes, together with the elders, confronted him and spoke to him, saying, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who is he who gave you this authority?" Well, it's a question of authority, and it's interesting that Jesus has a unique way of answering questions with questions. They want to talk about authority, so let's talk about authority. And as he does that, we're going to see quite an interesting little battle unfold that clearly would have let the people know where Jesus stood and that he's unafraid to speak the truth, but he wants to speak it with people who want to be truthful in their dealings. So let's first think about these opening things. To regulate the controls and the affairs of the temple belonged really, unquestionably, and exclusively to the priests and the Levites. Anybody that's studied the law of Moses is well aware of that. And yet, here Jesus came into the temple, as we've already observed, and he cleansed the temple. He drove out the money changers who were making an unreasonable profit, and they were using the house of the Lord, which should be a house of worship, in order ultimately to, as we can see in the previous chapter, in order openly to make a profit, and a pretty good sized profit at that. And so they are trying to put Jesus in a position to where he is going to be disgraced by the fact that he assumed authority that is not his. That's at least their assumption. But now watch as he answers, and he turns the tables on them to the point where really they're not going to be able to get the answer they desire because they are unwilling to answer his question. So listen to what he says, verses 3 and 4. But he answered and said to them, "I also will ask you one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men?" Now, if this is all about a question of authority, then guess what? Jesus is now saying, well, let's talk about authority. Let's talk about a fellow by the name of John the Baptist. Now, of course, the people believed that John was a prophet. And Jesus has got the Jews in a unique position. His question is intimately and inseparably connected, McGarvey says, with the question they had asked. Why? Because John had clearly testified, in fact, very, very plainly in public, to the messiahship of Jesus, and had, in no uncertain terms, designated Jesus as immeasurably greater than himself. So if they were to acknowledge the authority of John, then all of a sudden Jesus has the authority as the one come down from God, as the Messiah. He does have the authority to do the things he's doing. If they do not accept it, well, that's a different story. And that's the exact thing that Luke reports to us next in verse 5 and following. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But if we say from men, all the people will stone us, for they are persuaded that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where he was from. It should be noted that in their consultation, according to McGarvey, there is no effort either to ascertain or to speak the truth. And he's right. There's nothing about their talking among themselves that would indicate they care what the truth is. Whether John was from heaven or from men didn't matter to them. All they cared about was what will be the perception based on how we answer this question. They were seeking then for the most expedient answer. And as neither truthful answer was expedient, they resolved to falsely deny any knowledge of the case. Now, I suspect that the real answer was, we think the baptism of John was from men. I think that's what they really believed. But they couldn't afford to answer it that way. And if they believed it was from God, then Jesus' question would have been appropriate if he'd have followed up with that. And that would have been, well, then why didn't you do what he said if you believed he was from God? And so they lie about it. They just answer without any truthfulness at all. We don't know. Well, I doubt that that's really the true answer. So listen as we continue in verse 8. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. And when McGarvey looked at that, notice he says, their spoken lie was, we know not. But their inward and true answer was, we will not tell. And Jesus answered the suppressed truth by saying, neither will I tell. You won't tell me, I won't tell you. You want to know about my authority? You answer the question about John. They were unwilling to do that. And Jesus put them on the horns, as it were, of their own dilemma, turned the tables completely upon them. Well, then Jesus immediately tells a parable that I really believe grows out of the previous discussion. So let's start at verse 9 and read the parable. Then he began to tell the people this parable. A certain man planted a vineyard, leased it to vine dressers, and went into a far country for a long time. Now, at vintage time, he sent a servant to the vine dressers, that they might give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the vine dressers beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent another servant, and they beat him also, treated him shamefully, and sent him away empty-handed. And again, he sent a third, and they wounded him also and cast him out. So Jesus, of course, would not answer the question of the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, their question of authority. But he would use that incident to actually tell a parable that would help the common people understand what the real situation was. It is interesting to me to note that God, in Isaiah chapter 5 in particular, had described Israel as a vine that he tenderly planted and he expected to reap a wonderful harvest of grapes out of it. But instead of them growing up to be the kind of vine he wanted them to be, they produced nothing but wild grapes, and those are not really useful. They refused in the process of that to do what God wanted them to do. Well, in this parable, it's the tenants who will not do what the owner wants them to do. We would say they're somewhat like sharecroppers. The vineyard belongs to the owner, to the master. But he has leased it out to these tenants, and the expectation is that every year at harvest time, he can send and collect a percentage, whatever was agreed upon. That would be his rent money, as it were, for a year. But every time he sends a servant, they beat him, and they throw him out, and they won't give him anything. Now, Ash suggests that if we compare the treatment of the servants in this parable to the treatment of the prophets in the Old Testament, we're going to see many similarities. For example, in 1 Kings chapter 18, you find the mistreatment of the prophets. And of course, that occurred under Jezebel and Ahab. You've got also in 1 Kings chapter 22, more mistreatment of the prophets. By the way, I may have been wrong on that. I may have mixed those two up, but I know 1 Kings 18, 1 Kings 22, then Jeremiah 37, verse 15. And boy, did they ever mistreat Jeremiah. And then you got 2 Chronicles 24, 15 through 22. And they wouldn't listen to God's prophets at all. 2 Chronicles 36, 11 through 21. What are the consequences of them not listening to the prophets? Well, the consequences are ultimately that an evil nation comes in, Babylon, and conquers Judah because they failed to listen to God. Nehemiah also refers to these things in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 26. So it appears within the parable, because especially of what follows, that the owner of the vineyard in this parable is God himself, and that the tenants are the Jews, but especially these wicked rulers of the Jews during the day of Christ. Of course, they were following after, or in the footsteps of, if you would, their Jewish forefathers who had rejected the prophets. But these are the ones that Jesus is zeroed in on now. So let's go ahead and look at verse 13. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Probably they will respect him when they see him." He had one more to send, a beloved son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, "They will respect my son." That I just quoted is the way that the New American Standard Bible translates this. It's much more powerful in the New American Standard, which follows more closely the actual words that are in the original language here. And listen to that again. He had one more to send, a beloved son. Only one spokesman was left, his own son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, "They will respect my son." Well, they didn't, of course. We know that. Jesus is God's spokesman for today. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 opens up with that very idea. And yet they would not, they did not listen to him. So verses 14 and 15, watch the response of the tenants in the parable. But when the vine dressers saw him, they reasoned among themselves, saying, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, that the inheritance may be ours." So they cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do to them? The Jewish leaders mistakenly believed that killing Jesus would result in their keeping control of the nation. Now, there's an example of that, very clear, in the book of John, chapter 11, and we're going to briefly turn there, beginning at verse 45. Listen. Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him. Now, of course, we're talking about immediately after the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead, who had been in the grave 4 days. So there's no doubt he's dead. No question at all. And many Jews believed. But now watch. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." Listen to that. What do they think about God's people? They're our people. What do they think about this nation that belongs to God? It's our nation. That's the way they think about things. And when they look at Jesus, they see him as a usurper to their power. And that's really all that they're concerned about. So keep reading and see what happens. And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish." Now this he did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So the Jews rejected, the Jewish leaders rejected Jesus, thinking that if they could get rid of him, get rid of the heir, then the nation would belong to them. It's a false conclusion, and Jesus is going to demonstrate that very, very clearly in what follows. In fact, listen to the way he concludes the parable in the 16th verse. He will come and destroy those vine dressers and give the vineyard to others. If you compare this with Matthew chapter 21, verse 41, then you, I think, come to this conclusion, at least I did. Apparently the people, the common people, spoke and Jesus concurred with what they had to say. If this is what they do, the owner is going to come and kill them and throw them out. And the common people got it right. But now watch the end of that 16th verse. And when they heard it, they said, certainly not. Now I want you to listen to McGarvey's thoughts on that verse. Part of the multitude, hearing only the story, pronounced unhesitatingly the judgment which ought to be inflicted upon such evildoers. And Jesus confirmed their judgment. But others, perceiving the meaning underlying the parable, shrank from accepting what would otherwise have been to them a very proper ending, and said, "Me genodio," which means literally, "Be it not so." No, that can't be. Now you see, they're figuring out who this is that he's talking about in the parable, and the instruction is quite powerful. So we pick up now at verse 17, and here's how Jesus responds. Then he looked at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Whoever falls on that stone will be broken, but on whomever it falls, it will grind him to powder." Jesus quotes there from Psalm chapter 118, verses 22 and 23. And as McGarvey says, it is here by Jesus applied as a prophecy to the Pharisees, who, in their treatment of him, were like unskilled builders who rejected the very cornerstone of the building which they were trying to erect. The Pharisees were eager enough in their desire to set up a messianic kingdom, but were so blindly foolish that they did not see that this kingdom could not be set up unless it rested upon Jesus Christ, its cornerstone. Jesus has indicted them as unskilled builders. They like to think themselves highly. We're going to see more of that later in the chapter. And Jesus just robs them of all that ability with this statement. So in verse 19, listen to how they think about it. And the chief priests and the scribes that very hour sought to lay hands on him, but they feared the people, for they knew he had spoken this parable against them. They would have taken him, for they saw the parable was levied against them, but their fear of the people compelled them to defer their actions. That was H. Leo Bowles' comment in his commentary on this chapter out of the book of Luke, this 20th chapter. So they changed their approach. Up until now, the Pharisees came personally. But now they're not going to come personally. They're going to send their minions. They're going to send their disciples to do the job. And there seems to be a method to their madness. At least McGarvey sees one, and we'll talk about that. Let's go ahead and read the 20th verse. So they watched him and sent spies. Watch the word, spies, who pretended to be righteous, that they might seize on his words in order to deliver him to the power and authority of the governor. The Pharisees thought it best to speak their cunning through the mouths of their own young disciples, whose youth and apparent desire to know truth would, according to their calculation, take Jesus off guard. That's what McGarvey thinks the plan is here. And it sure looks like that fits what's going on. But now look at verse 21 as it continues, because they're going to ask their question. Then they asked him, saying, Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism, but teach the way of God in truth. It's a pretty flattering statement, no matter who makes it. It is obviously intended to draw him in and get him to give the answer that they desire. When McGarvey looked at that, he said, we see that neither fear nor respect for the Pharisees or the rulers prevents you, that is Jesus, from speaking the plain, disagreeable truth. And we are persuaded that your courage and love of truth will lead you to speak the same way in political matters, and that you will not be deterred therefrom by any fear or reverence for Caesar. That's what they thought. Now, what about it? Well, they're going to ask their question, and I call this question the tax trap, because you'll see it involves a tax. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? The Jews were required to pay annually a large sum of money to the Roman government in an acknowledgement of their subjection, McGarvey says. About 20 years before this, Judas of Galilee had stirred up the people to resist this tribute, and the mass of the Jews were bitterly opposed to it. So you see, the Jewish leaders know that they got to somehow separate Jesus from the common folks, or they're not going to be able to carry out their desire to eliminate Jesus, to put him to death. So to decide in favor of this tribute was therefore to alienate the affection and confidence of the throng in the temple who stood listening to him, and in most desirable to the Pharisees. They really would have liked to have seen that happen. If, on the other hand, Jesus said that the tribute should not be paid, the Herodians, of course they're the followers of Herod, who was an underling of the Roman government, that they would be present to hear it and would be witnesses sanctioned by Herod, and therefore, as such, by Pilate, they would be compelled to respect, because Pilate was over Herod. But what divine wisdom could escape from so cunningly devised a dilemma? That's the question that McGarvey asks, and boy, does he ever use amazing divine understanding and wisdom in the following verses. So pick up now at verse 23. But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, why do you test me? The word craftiness here is a word that Reinecker says means a readiness to do anything. In particular, it's skill, but it's skill in the negative sense of the word. That's why craftiness fits here. He asked them why they sought to ensnare him, and it is very powerful to realize that this same word is used way back in chapter 4 when we talk about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness by the devil. So these fellows are basically playing the role of the devil. But he's asked for a coin, as we've already seen, or we're about to see. Verse 24. Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription does it have? They answered and said, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. The money that they were using back then, and we've got some today, there actually have been some of those coins found, and you can see the image of Caesar on it. That would be a different Caesar for different eras, but still, we can see the way that it was. If Jesus basically is saying, if they were ready and willing to accept Caesar's money and use it, then they were bound to accept his taxes. And that was the argument that Ash made. And by the way, he referenced Romans 13, 1 through 7, which clearly indicates the authorities that authority comes from God, and that we're to submit to them, and we're to pay taxes if they ask us to pay taxes. So that's really God's view of the matter. Man, in contrast, not the money, but man, is made in the image of God, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And as such, our whole, what we're all about, what God made us for, was to fear God and keep his commandments, according to the wise preacher of the Old Testament in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13. So once again, Jesus has taken the horns of their dilemma, and he has broken that by demonstrating something very, very powerful. They are made in the image of God, and yet they really are not paying God his due. And isn't that somewhat amazing and sad at the same time? So verse 26, but they could not catch him in his words in the presence of the people, and they marveled at his answer and kept silence. The questioners not only failed to catch him, but they suffered the embarrassment of having no retort to his argument. Ash continued with that thought, and I believe he's right on the money there. They have been foiled right in the presence of the people, and it really ought to be quite embarrassing to them. Now, beginning in verse 27, it's the Sadducees' turn, so to speak, to come to Jesus. The Pharisees have been put to silence. The Sadducees see that. And so now here they come, and they're going to take their shot at him. They're going to see if they can hamstring him with their argument. And I think that this argument, by the way, many other commentators think so too, although our thoughts are not infallible. Now, you should know that. But I suspect that this argument had been used before with the Pharisees, who do believe in a resurrection. They do believe in the spirit world, unlike the Sadducees. But they don't really have knowledge about what the marital status or whatever is going to be in eternity, and so they can't answer this argument. But Jesus has a whole different perspective, and he'll be able to answer it. So begin at verse 27 of Luke 20. Then some of the Sadducees, who deny that there is a resurrection, came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife, and he dies without children, his brother should take his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died without children. The second took her as wife, and he died childless. And the third took her, and in like manner the 7 also. And they left no children and died. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife does she become? For all 7 had her as wife. Well, the whole argument they're making is based on the law of levirate marriage. If you want to read more about that, you can look to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. And their argument is valid based on that law. What they talk about in reference to the law is correct, but their knowledge of the resurrection is woefully deficient. And that is exactly where Jesus goes next as he answers them. Jesus answered and said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are counted worthy to attain that age and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, nor can they die any more. For they are equal to the angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. Jesus shows that their assumption about marriage continuing in the resurrection is in error. And in the process, he lets them know that angels do not marry. Well, guess what? They don't believe in angels either. So look at Acts chapter 23, verse 8. You may remember Paul has been brought there before the Sanhedrin, and he looks out to that crowd and he sees, well, there's Sadducees here and there are Pharisees here. And he takes advantage of that and he says, I'm standing before you today because I taught about the resurrection of the dead. And of course, the Pharisees immediately think, whoa, what a great guy he is. and it's quite a response. So pick up at verse 6, and we'll just see the story as Luke reports it. This is Acts 23:6 beginning. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Well, Jesus knew that, and really in his answer, he's saying, I know about the resurrection. And well, I'll tell you what else I know. I know angels are real. And knowing both of those facts, he said, you've made a mistake because you don't understand there's no marriage in the resurrection. So pick up now at the following verse, verse 37, and see that he says, But even Moses showed in the burning bush passage that the dead are raised, when he called the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. For he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. Now, when McGarvey looked at this, he reminded us that the Sadducees held that the dead man had ceased to exist, that he had vanished into nothingness. Now, according to their view, then, God had styled himself as the God of nothing, which, as McGarvey says, is absurd. That just won't work. There's no way that God is the God over nothing. And yet that's basically the argument that they are making. And so, in the following verses, verse 39 and 40, we find, Then some of the scribes answered and said, Teacher, you have spoken well. But after that, they dared not question him anymore. It is interesting that some of the scribes, whom McGarvey describes as less bitter, were actually able to acknowledge that what Jesus had said was a powerful argument. See, the Sadducees held very strongly to two things. The first being the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the second, they probably held to it a little stronger. The second was the tradition of the elder, or the traditions of the elders. So Jesus took their own scripture, because Exodus, of course, is the second of the first 5 books. And he used their own scriptures to demonstrate that their argument was ridiculous. And these Pharisees, these scribes, who had never been able to answer that argument, likely, now hear, well, Jesus did something we've never been able to do. And that's a pretty good answer, when you think about it. So, beginning at verse 41, he said to them, How can they say that the Christ is the son of David? Now, David himself said in the book of Psalms, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Therefore, David calls him Lord. How is he then his son? Jesus now throws a real powerful dilemma before those scribes in particular, but really before whoever happens to be assembled there. And the problem is that the Jews have a complete disconnect here. They cannot see that the Messiah that they see coming, who they think is going to reign on earth, they cannot see that he could be both Messiah and God. They can't see that he could die and yet live. They can't see that he could be weak, as men might view it, and yet strong and overcome the devil. All those things were outside of their ability to see. Their presuppositions about the Messiah and the establishment of an earthly kingdom kept them from really understanding this quotation. Jesus was going to be God incarnate. He was God incarnate. And as such, he was both the son of David by descent. You see that in Matthew chapter 1 very clearly, and of course also in Luke chapter 3. And then he was also son of God, and thus the Lord of David, which is an amazing thing and yet a true thing. So pick up at verse 45. Then in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, Beware the scribes, who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. The scribes loved the honor of men. And really everything that Jesus said there has to do with honor. But somehow, and I don't know how, they took advantage of widows. Now, if you know the law, for example, Exodus chapter 22, verses 22 to 24, and Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 19, you know that God has said that you've got to take care of the helpless. That would be the stranger and the widow and the orphan. And to fail to do so, especially Deuteronomy 27 indicates, is going to lead to a severe punishment. Jesus is warning the people. You got to be careful about these folks. They love the honor of men, and they're not real worried about honoring God by keeping his law. And what a powerful ending to a chapter in which Jesus dealt with every problem they threw at him. He handled every confrontation, put them to silence, showed that he understood the will of God far better than they did. And at the very end, he warned the people, do not pay attention to them. They do not honor God, and they are going to pay a high price for it. God will judge them because of it. We need to learn from those people. Learn to be humble. Yield to Jesus. It's the only way to really, really expect to live in heaven with God for eternity.